For those first European settlers arriving here at Nelson's waterfront, it must have felt like they'd reached the promised land. And in many respects, it was. Except the settlers weren't the only ones promised a piece of this bountiful whenua. An agreement called the Nelson Tenths envisioned a European and Māori settlement.
As part of that agreement by our ancestors to establish Nelson, there was an agreement which came to be known as the Nelson Tenths. So the Nelson settlement was established, but on two really important conditions. The first was that 1/10 of the area, the rohe, would become the Nelson Tenths, reserved in perpetuity for the rangatira and their descendants, our whānau and hapu. And then the second condition was that all of our papakainga lands, our wāhi tapu, the places where we cultivated food, would also be protected from the Nelson settlement.
Carenza Johnston is Chief Executive of the Nelson-based Wakatu incorporation that's leading the litigation against the Crown. She's also a descendant of the Te Tauihu Māori who signed the original agreement with the New Zealand Company in 1839.
When I think about the New Zealand Company, I sort of think about them as the private developers of the day, but very much supported by the Crown at the time in terms of the development and colonisation project that they had underway. And so a key part, a critical part of that proposal was that relationships with us, with Māori, the Indigenous owners of the land, had to be protected and respected in order essentially to facilitate peaceful colonisation. From our perspective, we were actually really excited about settlers coming into Nelson. We wanted to access technology, education, relationships, and trade for us was particularly important. So we were supportive of the New Zealand Company establishing the settlement here.
Here at Te Mātu, the remains of a tōtara forest, more than 600 tonnes of potatoes were grown by Māori to feed the incoming settlers. By 1845, a Crown grant was issued acknowledging the New Zealand Company would reserve 1/10 of the land it was settling for Te Tauihu Māori.
And then the Crown actually takes the next step, which is they map out the whole rohe and actually identify all of those reserves on maps, and then begin the process of actually physically making those reserves. And so from 1845 to about 1850, reserves are being created on the ground, but by 1850 the population is starting, the balance is starting to change here in Nelson, and by 1850 the settler population has overtaken the Māori population, and so the balance of power is starting to change from that time onwards.
The dream of settlement here in Nelson back in 1840 should have been a shared dream between the settlers arriving and Māori landowners. The New Zealand Company had set aside a plan for 151,000 acres. 1/10 of that was reserved for Māori, 15,100 acres. It never happened, not even close. And 180 years later, the descendants of those Māori are fighting for justice.
For every area of land that was taken, 1/10 was to be set aside for the descendants of our tupuna, the families of then and the families today.
Ko mātua Rory Stafford is pursuing the claim against the Crown on behalf of Te Tauihu descendants. When did the mana whenua start raising concerns about what was happening?
So our whānau and hapu started raising concerns about the breaches of the agreement almost from day one. So as it became clear to us, in particular, that our papakainga lands and our wāhi tapu were not being accepted from the Nelson settlement, weren't being protected in the ways that we had agreed, we started to advocate and challenge the decisions that were made. And again, in those early days, that was primarily through petitions, through letters, through visits to Parliament, and trying to advocate with officials around, ensuring that the Crown grant would be respected, and in particular that our really significant lands would be protected from the settlement.
Across a wall at Wakatu offices are the 309 names of tupuna, or ancestors, identified in 1892 by the Native Land Court, and whose descendants are now in litigation against the Crown. Many of those tupuna left the region just to survive.
A lot of the evidence that we put before the court when we prepared for this case was around what happened to our whānau through that period. Were they able to live on our lands? And of course the answer is no for the most part. So, while on the one hand we watched the town of Nelson prosper and prosper on our land, we weren't part of that.
The original blueprint of the then town of Nelson could have been a blueprint for settler Māori coexistence throughout colonial New Zealand. Instead, the fraction of land Māori ended up with was put into the hands of government-appointed agents and invariably tied up in perpetual leases yielding less than 1% of the land value.
We own the land, but we couldn't walk on it. So it's that journey that I start to understand somebody needs to take up the challenge.
In 1977, Māori gained control of what little remained of the Nelson Tenths, establishing Wakatu Incorporation to manage it.
One of the hardest things for the whānau at that time was on day one realising the Crown, the Māori trustee, was the largest shareholder in the incorporation. So somehow they had managed to acquire the largest interest in the land in their time as being supposedly the kaitiaki of that whenua for us. So the first order of business for the Wakatu board at that time was to take out a loan to buy back the shares from the Māori trustee. They refused to give them to us.
It took another 15 years before Wakatu finally gained control of some of its most valuable land, like this horticultural farmland around Motueka. Land comprises 70% of the incorporation's assets. Now one of the largest private landowners in Te Tauihu, the top of the South Island, it has grown its asset base from 11 million in 1977 to around 350 million today.
How do we create thriving businesses that bring people back to our rohe, so high quality opportunities for employment, but that has to go hand in hand with housing. You can't have a strategy that brings people in for work without a housing strategy to run alongside that. And at the same time, you have to have that cultural capability program running so that we're doing it in ways that are aligned with our values.
Projects like this brand new Papakainga Kaumātua and whānau housing development, along with te reo and whakapapa educational programs, are helping bring whānau back to the region. But it's the legal battle for redress over their lost land that has been all-consuming, and their decision to pursue not a Waitangi tribunal claim, but a private law breach of trust case. Join me for the Nelson Tenths Agreement on NBR at nbr.co.nz.